All right, so in the last video, we touched on a lot. We went over functions, we went over variables a little bit. We went over the idea of returning values or doing functions and random numbers and if statements where we're checking to see if something is between certain numbers and this sort of thing. So, okay, there's all kinds of stuff in there. So we're going to break that down. We're going to come back a little bit and just talk about variables for a little bit. We're going to be doing a lot with variables, and that's going to be one of the big things that we're going to be touching on over and over. So in this last video, we used the variable to basically label or like hold the value of this number, this math.random. So just looking at that a little more, we could console log here math.random, and it'll give us a random number, if I can spell it right. And then after that, let's console log it again, math.random. So the thing about this is a function, just like this one. It's a function that's being run. You can identify it as a function because it has those little parentheses on the end. It's not just some value. It's not a variable. It's a function that's actually running. So every time we run the function, we get a different number. So let's save that and we'll reload this page. And we'll see here we get 0.17, then we get 0.13, and then we get 0.42. And that's going to correspond to, this is the first one, this is the second one, and the third one is our random number. It's doing the same thing. So that random number is really just, again, it's just a label. It's not like, it doesn't change the number in any way. It's just a label that we can hold it for later. Because, for instance, if we didn't hold it and we just put, if math.random is less than 0.5, and then later we checked if math.random, then every time it would be a different value. So we need a way to hold it once we create it and that it doesn't change again. And that's really one of the great uses of variables. They're just holding a value for us. So the simplest types of variables are strings, which are text like this, word, and also like this hello or these hellos. These are strings. They're what we call strings, strings of text, strings and numbers. And there's different types of numbers and blah, blah, blah. But you can just think of strings and numbers as your basic types of variables. We're going to be going into others later called arrays and objects, but that's for a couple videos down the line. So we can use different ways to define variables. Even in this example, I've used two different things. One says let, and then this one down here says const. So you don't really have to know the difference between these. The idea is that when you define a const, it stands for constant, and that means you're not changing it later on. Whereas the let one, you could change later on. But I just use them because you're probably going to see these different ones when you go look at JavaScript code. There's also an older way, which you'll see if you go look at older JavaScript code, which is var, which is very straightforward. It means variable. And that would have been like var random number equals 10 or something like that. So there used to be this way with var that you'll probably see, but it's basically the same as let. And for the most part, I'd recommend as a beginner, you just use the let thing or even the var. Later on, once you start to really get a handle on this, you can start using things like const or whatever. But I just didn't want you to be confused if you see that around out there in the wild. So one thing that's important to learn that we kind of have to learn about variables right away is the idea that we call scope. Now, there's a lot of terms I'm throwing at you, and hopefully you'll be able to write a couple of them down. But again, these will be best illustrated in practical terms as we do more and more coding and as we make problems. But let's try dealing with this idea of scope. Scope is basically saying that inside of a function, all the variables that are defined inside that won't exist outside the function. Okay, so for instance, in here we define this random number. Now, nowhere else in this code did we say let random number equals, right? It's only here. We define it here, which is inside this function. So if outside the function, I try to console log random number, let's see what happens. Okay, so I will console log random number. I'll reload this, and it's going to say random number is not defined. So that error happens because it doesn't know about random number because random number is inside the function. Okay, now if I defined random number outside the function, if I said random number equals 0 out here, or even if I made it say math.random, let's just say I take this whole line here and I cut it and I paste it above and I say let random number equals math.random, okay, now it's defined outside the function. Inside the function, we don't define it. We reference it, but we don't define it. So I reload this and I don't get that error. And actually it console logs the same thing for both because it's defined what we could say globally. It's defined for the whole script that I'm writing, the whole program that I'm writing. Everywhere has access to this random number variable because it's defined outside the function. Okay, so it's a bit of a weird concept and you might not understand the implications of it yet. But for instance, if you tried later to change the random number value by saying, now I want random number to be 0, or if you tried to define another variable inside here that said random number, let's try doing that. Let's try defining another variable called random number and see what happens. We reload it and it works, but now we have different values for these two. Even though they're the same variable name, now there's different values for them because we've defined it in one place, then we've redefined it again, and now it's not so bad for the computer. The computer's not confused, but that'll get really confusing for us. So when it comes to variables, you really want to make sure that you are kind of careful about reusing the same variable name over and over, and really pay attention to this thing of, am I defining it inside a function or outside of a function? So I just wanted to introduce you to this idea and to the notion that you should be a little bit careful with how you're doing the variable stuff. A lot of your bugs later on when you're writing your code are going to come from variables being defined wrong or undefined or not being sent to the right place or being the wrong type of variable. All this kind of stuff is going to be very, very common. So getting used to variables and naming them nicely, you know, like just like we named the function pick a random word, we named the random number. We didn't just name it, you know, variable 1 or something, which would be, you know, that it would still work the same. But for us later, coming back to this code 2 years later, we aren't going to know why the heck we named it variable 1, and we're going to have to actually figure out what the code's doing. So we want to name things in a legible way that's readable. So later we come back, we're like, oh, I know what that variable meant. That's easy to understand. And we want to make sure we pay some attention to this idea of scope, or this idea that variables are defined in certain places in the code and can be passed around. Okay, so again, we're throwing lots at you. We're diving right in, but you wanted to learn some JavaScript, you wanted to learn some web development. So in the next videos, we're going to go over this same function and some different ways to write it. We're basically going to do the exact same function, but we're going to use different variables to write it and just explore those different types of variables and also how to manipulate them in different ways to do some cool stuff for us. And at the end of all that, once we've got this base of like what are variables and we have functions and we have you know, loops and some other stuff, then we're going to go and make our calculator work using the concepts that we've learned. So thanks. We'll see you in the next one.